afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Chairman and Committee of Killkenny Arts Week, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming to the opening of Steve Johnson's exhibition. Honestly, I just have to thank a few people who made all this possible. First, obviously, the Office of Public Works and Paddy Field in particular for making this venue available to us. For this second year we've used it, and thank you to them and to all the staff in the Castle Fund. Also to some sponsors who actually made Steve Johnson's visit possible. Apple Computer, Micro Memory, Image Masters, Kodak Photologic, and Barry Pender. And Barry Pender particularly, who just pulled us out of a major hole at the last second in terms of transport. I'd also like to say a particular thanks to the visual committee of Killkenny Arts Week, who did Trojan work to get this display system up, and not just this display but all the other exhibitions as well. I'd like to introduce a few people who are just going to speak very, very briefly, just to put in context what the exhibition is all about. But first, I'd just like to say how the exhibition came about from my point of view. I met Stephen Johnson in London about 18 months ago. Fortuitously, he was one of the keynote speakers at a conference on digital photography that I was attending in my capacity as a photographer at the National College of Art and Design. And I happened to be sitting down at lunch and spoke with Steve and floated the notion that maybe he'd like to show his work at Killkenny Arts Week, with which I was peripherally involved at the time. And subsequent to that, I sent him a brief handwritten fax to America, suggesting it in a more formal footing, and he agreed. And since then, over the last 18 months, I didn't speak to him again until I met him at the airport. All of the organisation of this festival was done by email, which was in itself sort of a technological, I suppose, marvel in some way, but that was great. And both of us, I think, lots of times were tempted to pick up the phone, but we kept the email going just for fun, I think. So it was great. It's an absolute delight for me to have Steve here. Being a photographer myself, I can appreciate the quality of the work. Having seen the show, or the few prints that he showed in London, and hearing him speak, I was just completely in awe of the man himself, his passion for photography, his vision of photography, his understanding, his wonderful articulate sense in explaining the technology. So I just felt that, well, I've got to have him here. And I'm sure everybody's going to respond to the wonderful photographs. The technology is only one part of it. The aesthetics of the images that you see are really what it's all about. But I'd like to introduce somebody who is a long, long time friend of Steve's, who can say a little bit more about Steve himself. That is Kevin O'Farrell, who is ex-design director of the Academy of Science. He's also a design consultant worldwide to museums and galleries worldwide. He's also a consultant in Ireland to the Office of Public Works on their national monuments on multimedia type installations. He's more or less a native in that he lives part of the year in Sneem in County Kerry. So it's wholly appropriate that you should come here. So I'd like to hand you over to Kevin O'Farrell to say a few words about Steve.
I've known Steve for 15 years now, and his wife for 18 years. His wife Mary, who's definitely linked into this exhibit, used to work for me. And Steve came in full of passion for a subject on Mono Lake, a lake that was being eroded by commercial interests and so forth in California. And Steve got an assortment of photographers ranging from Ansel Adams to Galen Rowell to everybody to contribute photos, including Steve's work, to this brilliant exhibit. And the exhibit was both an artistic triumph and it was a subject-wise triumph in that we moved people towards trying to conserve this wonderful area. Now Steve, through all of his work, I've been watching him develop for the last 15 years. His work has evolved to the point that he's always maintained that same passion for the subject matter, but his media has evolved with the changing times. He's gone from conventional photography to now this digital format here. And in a lot of ways, the digital format is perfect for him because the way your eye sees, you've got a series of rods and cones in your eye. And in effect, you digitize what you see. And you have this fuzzy logic in your brain that scrambles it all together, and it makes it look like it's seamless. Well, these photos seem to capture that same quality. And I want to thank Steve so much for coming to Ireland, which is my other native land, and gracing the country here with his particular vision. And hopefully that vision will be applied to some of the wonders that we have around here. And so maybe the next show that we see of Steve's work in Killkenny here will be of some of the images and the wonders of Ireland. I also, because I do design exhibits and so forth, wanted to comment on this space. This is one of the most unique exhibit spaces an artist could be honored with. And I've often said that sometimes the space overpowers the exhibit. Like I lecture at the Louvre and the British Museum and so forth, and they have spaces there that you often don't see the Mona Lisa because the building is so outrageous. In this particular space, with this photography here, it's a beautiful marriage, though, where we look at these staunch faces glaring down at us. They were sitting there for 6 months waiting for their photo to be, or their image to be taken there. And consequently, that's why they do look as sour as they often do, where you see the joy that could come out of it now if Steve did it in a digital way where they could be having a good time when this thing, when their photograph is being taken. Perhaps their persona would be totally different. And so we've gone through the whole evolution almost of art, looking at this building and then finally getting into Steve's digital work. And I have to compliment him on being a genius and a wonderful human being and a great father. See you.
Thanks, Kevin. At somewhat short notice, the first person we were going to have to open the show was unavoidably detained on some business elsewhere. So we are very, very fortunate to have a colleague of mine, in fact my boss, Professor Noel Sheridan, who is the director of the National College of Art and Design, and to come and open the show for me, please. Thanks.
A great deal has been said. Let me say it's a great pleasure to be asked to say a few words at the opening of this exhibition of wonderful photographs. Now, I think what intrigues everybody, what I am not going to be talking about, is the technology that makes all of this possible. I think there's a certain threshold of megabytes where my brain collapses, but I do know, you think you know how to look at art. Let me say I came in knowing it was a photographic show, and when you look at it, say, yes, it is photographs, but not photographs like anything I've ever seen before. And also you think, it's like art, it's like painting or watercolor, but then on a closer look, you see, yes, it is like, but very uniquely itself. And it's somewhere between those two traditions that we sense something new emerging, and certainly a new feeling for space, a new feeling about how we might see the world. Very briefly, I think, let's say, take as a painter, the relationship of photography to fine art. With its invention, many of the things that so-called art has spent laborious hours trying to do were suddenly made redundant. And this pressed art, if you like, into what we know as modernism, a sort of self-reflexive examination of itself. Photography, its great strength in narrative and being able to catch split-second things that even the human eye couldn't see, that was its great strength. I think it wanted at the time, and quite rightly, to be seen as an art form, but very often it was, how do you get the photograph, if you like, to look like either the tradition of painting. And the limitation at that time was that there was just so much you could do with tone, with just so much this silver-based film could do that was limiting. Then a period of the 60s, I suppose, where a lot of photography was used in conceptual or performance art, but it was mostly for documentation. Really, the thrust of photography, even in the highly developed Cibachrome, it has great difficulties with postmodernism because its history isn't long enough for it to go back and appropriate the way, if you like, the fine arts could do. I think, and this distinction, I hope Steve will say a few words, because I think there is a key issue here. This puts so much power in the hands of the photographer that all kinds of manipulations and forging, and I use that word, and we do forge reality, but where you withdraw from that, how much you fabricate, how much you try to get the technology to say, this is what I am seeing, and this is what I'm seeing through this technology. And I think it's almost now, I think Stephen mentioned this in some of his text, the baffling thing for the photographer is you have this amazing, sophisticated mechanism that you all have, and you can just press a button, but you don't know what's happening. I mean, it's all happening in a split second. It gets developed. If you got lucky, you got lucky, and there's only so much you can do. This new technology is the radical change. The artist is now looking at the image, can gauge the image, can make everything and check it beforehand, and it just comes straight on. So there's a tremendous power, and maybe if you get into the technicalities of just what this can do, I really do think we're looking at something new. And as Ezra Pound says, right, the great thing for art is to make it new. And we think of new, but what is the it? And it is the it in the center that is the tradition, that is constant, that is the art that says to you, this is the world we live in, this is what it looks like, and this is what artists do for us. Artists also affect the way that we see things. If you go to Aix and Provence, you can't stop it being a Cézanne, because we know this. But one of the things, and I think this is a remarkable feature of this work, having seen the show and gone back to the garden in the Butler Gallery, which I just left having had a cup of coffee and just sort of walked through, suddenly all of that, just the shrubbery, the flowers, a little bit of a sort of outhouse, you kind of got the feeling, geez, this camera's got to get over here. Steve's got to get over here and save this and document this. And I think when you look through and see what it can do, I'll just say one other thing about things that are made redundant. Some of the pieces that look like the most delicate watercolors that in the 19th century all these apprentices were trained to do 20 washes and 30 glazes, and yet you know, that labor-intensive thing is possible. Well, it's not just possible through this technology. It's only possible, I think, if you have an artist of the sensitivity and sensibility of Stephen. I think we're very privileged to see the show, and I'm delighted to declare it open, but I hope that Stephen will say a few words to us. Okay.
Thank you for those very nice introductions. I'm not sure that I can rise to the occasion of trying to fulfill the compliments. The work needs to stand independent of the technology. I'm delighted to be able to bring work to Ireland that tends to break through some technological barriers and hopefully let you see more directly the world that film has been keeping you at some distance from, because film is so blind as compared to our eyes. I feel very lucky to be able to use an instrument that is much closer to what my eyes see, and to start to take photography in the direction of being less dramatically reductive of reality and more imitative of the rich world that we live in. And that feels like a marvelous opportunity as a photographer. I really appreciate the invitation. Anthony Hobbs has made us feel like family almost instantly upon arriving. Thank you so much. And the whole Arts Week effort that's brought my wife Mary and the children here for the month, in fact. and we will be wandering around Ireland, trying to get to know it a little bit. Feeling like a month is just a very small amount of time to come to know a land so rich, both in heritage, visual, and storytelling. And so we're very pleased to be here, very grateful that we are being able to show the work in such a huge and magnificent space. I hope that in your minds the work lives up to the magnificence of the room. The privilege to be able to show you a glimpse of my new project is very deeply felt on my part. This is the largest gathering of work of a project I'm doing on the American National Parks that we've yet shown. The biggest group up to this point was about 20 prints shown in Carmel, California about 2 months ago. And the show will be done in about a year from now. So you really are seeing a taste of a work in progress. I hope it gives you some glimpse of what the American park system holds in terms of its own grandeur, and gives you a taste of what photography can be, not just what it has been. It's not about a 500th of a second and shadows that are all black, which is what we're used to out of photography. It's about light, and light can be rich. A photographer friend of mine called me about 3 months ago inquiring about a workshop, and he said, I just don't know what to think about all this digital stuff. I'm curious, and I think that's probably where photography is going, but I have these doubts. I love silver. And I said, well, I love silver too, but by the same token, light is miraculous and film is funky. And to some degree, I've never understood how true that was until after photographing with this digital camera. This is the Diamond digital camera that I'm using for a few years, to understand how much of the effort as a photographer that I've made was about compensating for the failures of film, about trying to wedge the world as I see it with my eyes onto this very narrow range that photographic film can see. And I can't say that I can record what I see with my eyes yet, but I'm so much further along that road and have such a much broader view of the light that I see on the planet Earth with this digital technology than I ever could have with film, that I feel both very liberated and yet encumbered with a little more weight on my back and a little bit more time for every exposure. So thank you for coming today. It's a real privilege to be here. I hope you enjoy looking at the work.
I just want to say one last thing, and that is Steve will be giving a public lecture, illustrated lecture about his work on Thursday at 5 o'clock in Butler House, one of the series of artist lectures we're having. Also, he's doing 2 digital photography workshops over in Ormond College, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and Thursday, but unfortunately they're completely booked out. So you missed out. Thank you very much for coming and enjoyed the show.